Imagine you have a multi-trillion-dollar economy. You've got this massive industrial engine that basically drives the world, right? But it relies on just one highly vulnerable road to survive.
Yeah, a single point of failure.
Exactly. And if that road gets blocked, your factories shut down, the cities go dark, and your entire country essentially starves for energy in like a matter of weeks.
It's the ultimate strategic nightmare.
Right. That is the exact nightmare that keeps strategists in Beijing awake at night. And their solution, a $60 billion project driving a literal highway straight through the heart of Pakistan. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're taking a really close look at the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC.
And honestly, it is one of the most audacious geographical workarounds in modern history. For anyone joining us who really wants to understand the actual tectonic shifts happening in South Asia, beyond the daily political rhetoric, this is the defining project. To understand where CPEC is today, we have to look closely at the cause and effect chains that started, a decade ago, and how those grand ambitions are just colliding with the harsh realities on the ground right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the gap between that original grand vision from around 2015 and the stark reality we see today in 2025 is just massive. And as a quick mission for you, the listener, as we go through this, I want you to really keep an ear out for that specific shift from the 2015 vision to the 2025 reality.
It's a huge shift.
It is, but you really can't appreciate the current situation without first understanding the sheer physical scale of what China and Pakistan were actually trying to build. We were talking about a planned logistics corridor stretching approximately 3,000 kilometers.
Right, 3,000.
It starts at Pakistan's deepwater port, Gwadar, right down on the Arabian Sea, and cuts all the way up north to Kashgar, which is a city in China's Xinjiang province.
And we should clarify, this wasn't just like a highway project. Yeah. CPEC was explicitly designed to be the flagship initiative of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
The crown jewel, essentially.
Exactly. I mean, the initial financials alone tell a story of just incredible ambition. The original blueprints called for an investment of roughly $46 billion. And that was to be rolled out over 15 years.
$46 billion.
Yeah, but as the scope expanded, that number quickly swelled beyond $60 billion.
Right, because it was a whole ecosystem they were building. They weren't just pouring asphalt.
No, not at all.
The scope included parallel road networks and major rail links. The transit plan's centerpiece was the ML1 railway upgrade.
Mainline 1.
Right, the ML1. For context, if you're taking notes, the ML1 is essentially the central spine of Pakistan's railway network. It stretches from Karachi all the way up to Peshawar. Upgrading that was supposed to absolutely revolutionize their freight movement. Add to that the creation of 9 special economic zones, massive power plants, gas pipelines, and a sprawling network of fiber optics.
It's a massive geoeconomic footprint.
It is. But let's go back to that nightmare scenario I mentioned at the start. Why is Beijing willing to spend $60 billion to pave a path through Pakistan? It all comes back to a geographic bottleneck. Could you explain the Malacca choke point for us? Because that really seems to be the trigger event for this entire endeavor.
It absolutely is. What's fascinating here is how unchangeable geography just dictates modern state policy.
Yeah.
So the Strait of Malacca is this narrow waterway located between Indonesia and Malaysia, and it connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea.
Okay.
Now, the vast majority of China's energy imports, we're talking oil and gas coming from the Middle East, along with a massive chunk of its export trade, has to pass through that specific strait. It is a major global choke point.
So it's essentially a funnel, and, well, funnels can be plugged.
Precisely. In a geopolitical crisis or, say, a military conflict, if an adversary's navy were to blockade the Strait of Malacca, China's economy would face immediate catastrophic strangulation. They simply do not have the domestic energy reserves to keep their country running if those ships stop arriving. It's a massive vulnerability in their supply chains.
So CPEC is essentially a 3,000-kilometer bypass surgery for global trade.
That's a really great way to look at it, yeah.
Yeah.
The strategic motivation for Beijing is to secure direct land access to the Indian Ocean. Because right now, a Chinese cargo ship has to take a 13,000-kilometer sea voyage. It has to navigate the South China Sea, squeeze through Malacca, and sail all the way around India.
That's a long trip.
Right. But CPEC cuts that down to a mere 2,000-kilometer overland journey. Cargo can just be unloaded at the Gwadar port in Pakistan and trucked straight up to Kashgar in China.
Just to put those numbers in perspective for you listening, let's repeat that retention loop. 13,000 kilometers of highly vulnerable sea lanes reduced to just 2,000 kilometers on solid ground. From Gwadar to Kashgar, that is a game-changing logistical shortcut.
And, it solves a major domestic issue for China, too, because
Right.
Kashgar is in the Xinjiang province, which
Mhm.
is the far western frontier of China.
Mm.
And historically, Xinjiang has been economically underdeveloped and really physically isolated from the booming coastal cities, like Shanghai or Shenzhen. By developing Kashgar as a massive trade terminus, Beijing integrates Xinjiang deeper into the broader Chinese economy.
So it's internal development dressed as international trade.
Exactly. Plus, under the broader umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, this route offers landlocked, energy-rich Central Asian nations a physical plug-in point to finally access the Indian Ocean.
Okay, that makes perfect sense from Beijing's perspective. They get energy security, they bypass Malacca, and they get a regional economic boost. But let's flip the chessboard and look at Pakistan for a second. Because handing over a 3,000-kilometer logistical footprint within your own borders to a foreign superpower, that is a massive concession of leverage.
It is a huge gamble.
Right. Now, officially, Pakistan entered into this to upgrade its decaying infrastructure, to revive an economy that had been severely battered by decades of terrorism, energy shortages, and, frankly, internal mismanagement. But I have to push back here. You don't invite a foreign power to build a $60 billion corridor across your entire country just to fix some potholes in power lines. Pakistan has historically guarded its sovereignty fiercely. So why invite this massive foreign footprint? Is this purely economic, or is there a strategic shield at play here?
It is absolutely a strategic shield. The official positions naturally highlight the economic revitalization, the jobs and the infrastructure, but the strategic motivations are entirely dual purpose. Yes, the immediate goal was economic life support.
They needed the money.
Desperately, Pakistan needed capital that Western institutions were increasingly hesitant to provide. But strategically, Islamabad calculated that CPEC would bind Pakistan inextricably to China's core national security interests.
This means if China has $60 billion tied up in your roads and ports, China has a very vested interest in making sure your government doesn't collapse.
Exactly. It's geopolitical insurance. By deepening that bilateral reliance, Pakistan gained significantly greater strategic leverage against both the United States and India in the broader region.
Right.
If Pakistan faces a crisis, they have a superpower patron whose own economic lifeline literally runs through their territory. So if you're building an exam answer framework in your head right now, think of this as a 3-point mental bullet point list for stakeholder objectives.
Let's hear it.
Point 1, China gets an energy and trade shortcut, plus a potential naval foothold. Point 2, Pakistan gets immediate economic life support. And point 3, both nations get enhanced strategic leverage in a multipolar region.
That's a perfect synthesis. Let me just repeat that for the listeners so it sticks. China gets the Malacca bypass. Pakistan gets an economic bailout. Both get strategic leverage. It sounds like a perfect marriage of convenience. And here is where the rubber meets the road, or in this case, where the highway meets a heavily militarized border.
Yeah, the geography problem.
Exactly. You cannot draw a 3,000-kilometer strategic corridor through South Asia without crashing right into the security architecture of the region. And that brings us directly to India's red lines.
Right. And this is where the geography gets highly, highly contentious, because the physical route of CPEC passes directly through the Gilgit-Baltistan region.
Which is disputed.
Deeply. This is territory that is part of the larger Kashmir region. India claims Gilgit-Baltistan as its own sovereign territory, which is currently administered by Pakistan. So it's effectively Pakistan Occupied Kashmir from India's legal standpoint.
And India's response to this hasn't been subtle at all. They have boycotted successive Belt and Road Initiative conferences over this exact issue. But I want to dig into the why here. So what does this all actually mean? Because on the surface, someone playing devil's advocate might say, well, it's just a road, why the diplomatic outrage? But this fundamentally alters the facts on the ground, doesn't it?
It does, and it raises a critical issue of international law intersecting with physical realities. When a foreign power, in this case China, finances and builds permanent heavy infrastructure in a disputed territory, it effectively legitimizes the current administration of that territory.
Right, it cements the status quo.
Exactly. But beyond the legal and sovereignty objections from New Delhi, there is a very real military implication. The presence of Chinese workers requires security, and that means the presence of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, in Gilgit-Baltistan, to oversee and protect these CPEC-related projects.
So it's not just cement mixers and civilian engineers, it's a militarized commercial project sitting right on India's doorstep. The movement of men and material between China and Pakistan suddenly becomes exponentially easier and faster.
That is the exact cause and effect chain India is worried about. If we break it down objectively, the geographic intrusion in Gilgit-Baltistan directly triggers the legal and sovereignty objections. Those are then compounded by the military reality of enhanced PLA logistics. And if you follow that chain all the way down the corridor, it extends into the maritime domain of the Indian Ocean.
Let's pause for a quick active recall check for you listening at home. Can you name the specific region that triggers India's sovereignty concerns regarding the CPEC route?
Take a second.
Right, it's Gilgit-Baltistan. Okay, so continuing that geographic chain down to the ocean, that brings us to the southern tip of the project, the Gwadar port. And you really have to look at where Gwadar actually sits on a map to understand the strategic anxiety here. It is on the Arabian Sea, positioned agonizingly close to the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, by Iran.
Yes, and that strait is one of the most vital oil shipping lanes on the planet. Having a deep water port right there gives China a potential facility for a naval presence in the Arabian Sea. It drastically impacts regional maritime security.
The maritime security implications of Gwadar really cannot be overstated, especially when you think about India's balancing strategy with the QBR and the broader Indo-Pacific dynamic.
Yeah.
To contextualize this, we have to look at China's broader naval strategy. China has already established its first overseas military base in Djibouti over in the Horn of Africa.
Where they have stationed Marines.
Exactly. So if Gwadar eventually transitions from a purely commercial port into a dual-use facility, one that can refuel and resupply Chinese naval vessels, it creates this highly strategic node. It links the South China Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the coast of Africa.
And Pakistan isn't pretending this is just a peaceful civilian commercial zone either. The institutional response has been massive. During the tenure of their former army chief, General Raheel Sharif, the Pakistan Army actually raised an entirely new military division.
The Special Security Division.
Right. They raised an entire division specifically tasked with protecting the CPEC route and the Gwadar port.
And that institutional dimension tells you everything you need to know. When a nation's military creates a dedicated, permanent division for a foreign-funded infrastructure project, it underscores exactly how completely intertwined the economic and security implications have become. It is no longer just a trade route. It is a vital national security asset.
Okay, so that was the grand vision, the 2015 blueprint. Billions in investment, massive strategic leverage, this whole reshaping of the geopolitical map. But international relations are never static, and building massive infrastructure is incredibly hard. Which brings us to the transition, because as we look at the reality in 2025, that initial momentum has hit a massive brick wall.
It really has. The shift from the blueprint to the reality on the ground today requires us to look at the implementation challenges, because the geoeconomic landscape has changed dramatically.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the status check today is, frankly, a bit grim. Yes, several energy projects and some road networks were completed, they're operational. But the transformational connectivity goals, the industrial revolution they promised,
They're unfinished or delayed.
or quietly abandoned altogether. Take the ML1 railway upgrade we talked about earlier. That was supposed to be the high-impact linkage holding the whole logistics chain together. It's essentially stalled.
Yeah, the ML1 is facing immense delays, and that is largely due to a distinct reluctance from China to commit funds on the original terms. And Gwadar Port itself is a perfect microcosm of the whole problem. The physical infrastructure of the port is there, but the dream of turning the surrounding city into a regional commercial hub, what politicians were constantly calling Pakistan's Dubai, that is absolutely not materialized.
It reminds me of a real estate project. Imagine you draw up plans to build this sprawling, futuristic mega mansion. You hire the architects, you lay the foundation, but then you realize you have constant disputes with the neighbors, people keep throwing rocks at the windows, and suddenly your bank freezes your credit line.
Right.
So you pivot. You decide to build a very functional, profitable commercial greenhouse on the property instead. It works, it makes some money, but it is definitely not the world-changing mega mansion you promised everyone.
That's a highly accurate analogy. The Grand Transit vision has been severely downgraded. And if you want to understand why mega projects fail, we can look at the 5 specific root causes that derailed CPEC.
Let's walk through those 5 root causes, because they really showcase how fragile these massive geopolitical plans actually are on the ground. The first major roadblock was security risks.
Specifically in Balochistan, which is the province where Gwadar is located, there have been repeated lethal attacks on Chinese workers and engineers by local insurgent groups.
Wow.
Yeah, these groups view the Chinese presence not as development, but as exploitation. And this violence made Chinese firms extremely cautious. Protecting their personnel became the central concern for Beijing. And, when security supersedes development, rapid construction just stops.
And it certainly doesn't help when the government overseeing that security is constantly shifting. Which brings us to the second cause, political instability in Islamabad.
We've seen frequent changes in Pakistan's government over the last decade. And with every change in leadership came policy reversals. They'd launch investigations into previous contracts, and there was just weak follow-through on the administrative reforms needed to attract actual industry.
So investor confidence just plummeted.
Absolutely. Even senior Pakistani ministers have publicly admitted that the constant political chaos resulted in massive missed opportunities.
But the friction wasn't just at the top political levels, right? It was happening at the grassroots level too, which is the third cause, governance failures and provincial grievances. Why are locals in places like Balochistan so angry in the first place?
It really comes down to poor sequencing and sheer exclusion. The local populations, especially in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, felt completely bypassed by the benefits of CPEC. Imagine massive infrastructure being built in your backyard. Your land is displaced, your fishing rights are restricted, but the jobs, the electricity, and the profits are all flowing out to Islamabad or back to Beijing.
That's a recipe for disaster.
It is. Without local buy-in, you face land disputes and immense societal friction that slows projects to a crawl.
So you have security threats, political chaos, and angry locals. But even if you somehow fixed all of that, you still need the money. And that brings us to the fourth cause, which is a shift coming directly from Beijing. China started pulling back.
Right. China's own economic priorities shifted dramatically. They grew very cautious about handing out these massive state-backed loans for huge infrastructure projects. This was part of a broader global reappraisal of the Belt and Road Initiative.
They realized the risk was too high.
Exactly. Beijing realized they were taking on too much risk in volatile countries. So they moved away from funding heavy upfront infrastructure and started demanding investments with much clearer, quicker commercial returns.
And they were looking at a partner that was essentially going broke, which is the fifth and arguably most devastating cause, external geopolitics and a massive macroeconomic crisis in Pakistan. Let's explain the balance of payments crisis, because this is the mechanism that really froze the concrete.
A balance of payments crisis happens when a country is importing vastly more than it is exporting, and it simply runs out of foreign currency reserves, like US dollars, to pay for essential imports like fuel, medicine, and food. When Pakistan hit this wall, they had to turn to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a bailout.
And the IMF isn't just going to hand over billions of dollars without looking closely at the books.
Not at all. The IMF imposes strict conditions. And one of their major concerns was the immense debt Pakistan owed to China for CPEC. The IMF essentially said, "We're not bailing you out just so you can use our money to pay back high-interest Chinese loans for mega projects."
So they were forced to choose.
Yes, Pakistan was forced to drastically cut its development budgets, which directly choked the financing for CPEC. Add to that the geopolitical pressure of trying to balance relations with the United States while holding massive Chinese debt, and Pakistan's strategic autonomy and financing options were completely paralyzed.
It's a cascading failure. Geopolitics drives economic crises, which drives domestic political instability, which ruins security, which stops the infrastructure. It is all completely connected. So, if the original vision is stalled, where does this leave CPEC in 2025? Because it hasn't been completely abandoned, has it?
No, it hasn't, but it has been heavily recalibrated. What we are seeing now is being termed CPEC 2.0. Pakistan and China recently initiated a renewal activity. They signed new memorandums of understanding for fresh investment pledges, reported around $8.5 billion. But the focus has shifted entirely.
Right, they aren't talking about massive new rail networks like the ML1 anymore. The leadership is suddenly very focused on industry, agriculture, and mining.
Because those sectors offer immediate extractable commercial value. The original sweeping vision of rapid industrialization through special economic zones and creating a seamless geopolitical transit corridor, that has been severely diluted.
The mega mansion to the greenhouse.
Exactly. CPEC 2.0 is pivoting toward commercially viable localized sectors. It will certainly deliver measurable economic gains, but the grand strategic transit vision, that Malacca bypass that was supposed to reshape global trade, has been drastically scaled back.
So let's do a rapid revision recap of this whole deep dive. We've journeyed from a grand geographic ambition to the reality of local economics. We started with China's desperate need to bypass the 13,000-kilometer vulnerability of the Strait of Malacca by building a 2,000-kilometer corridor from Gwadar to Kashgar.
And we saw how that ambition crashed into regional security realities, from India's strict sovereignty objections over Gilgit-Baltistan to the actual militarization of the route by the Pakistan Army's Special Security Division.
And finally, we unpacked how local grievances in Balochistan, political instability, and a crushing IMF debt crisis forced both nations to scale back. A $60 billion transit dream turned into an $8.5 billion pivot toward mining and agriculture with CPEC 2.0. It is a masterclass in how geographic ambition can be derailed by domestic realities.
It really is.
But before we wrap up, we always like to leave you, the listener, with a final thought, something to turn over in your mind that builds on the frameworks we've discussed today.
Right. So if we consider that CPEC 2.0 has shifted away from establishing a game-changing geopolitical transit route and is now focusing heavily on extracting resources like mining and agriculture, it raises a really crucial question. Does this recalibrated, extraction-based version still provide Pakistan with the strategic leverage it originally sought as a shield, or does it merely introduce a new, localized form of commercial dependency?
That is a brilliant question to mull over. When the infrastructure stops, who actually holds the leverage? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep applying these frameworks to the world around you, and we will catch you on the next one.